I've been sitting with one sentence for 3 weeks now. Not a chapter, not a passage. One sentence buried inside a story most people think they already know. And I genuinely cannot stop turning it over in my mind, because once I understood what it actually said, everything I thought I knew about money, about blessing, about why some people seem perpetually stuck, all of it shifted. And the strangest part? The sentence isn't about money at all. On the surface, it's about a desert, about a group of people who complained, and a God who apparently had enough. I want to tell you something before I go further, because I know exactly what some of you are thinking right now, sitting there. You're thinking, is God punishing me for something I did? You're thinking, I work hard, I try, and I watch other people receive blessings I can't seem to reach. You're thinking the thing nobody says out loud. Maybe I'm just destined to be poor. Maybe the heavens are closed over me specifically. Maybe there's a curse, a pattern, a wall I can't see but keep walking into. I've heard those thoughts. I've met them in my own chest, in moments I don't usually talk about. And this is why this particular sentence, in this particular ancient book, has been keeping me up at night. Because what Solomon saw, and what the Torah records with a precision that took me years to appreciate, is not a story about divine punishment. It's a story about a mechanism, a real, measurable, scientifically verifiable mechanism. And it operates inside you, right now, every single day. Stay with me here. Before we go deeper, if this kind of exploration resonates with you, the kind where ancient wisdom and modern evidence illuminate each other in ways that genuinely surprise you, subscribe and tell the algorithm you want more of this. I have so many more of these stories that won't leave me alone. The button takes 2 seconds. The conversation it opens lasts a lifetime. Now, let me take you back. I need to tell you about the day my mother stopped me in the middle of a sentence. I was maybe 14, sitting at the kitchen table in Nasuka, and I had been going on about something. Some unfairness at school, some friend who had something I didn't, some complaint that felt very urgent and very reasonable to me at 14. And she put down whatever she was doing, looked at me directly, and said in Igbo, "Do not call the darkness into this house with your mouth." I rolled my eyes. I was 14. My father was a British academic who talked about evidence and epistemology at the dinner table, and I had fully absorbed his habit of dismissing things that couldn't be footnoted. My mother's saying felt, to me, like the kind of thing people believed before they knew better, the kind of cultural inheritance that served a function once, perhaps, in conditions of genuine uncertainty, but that an educated person could now safely set aside. I held that dismissal for years, through the manuscripts, through 11 years of field research across Ethiopia and Egypt and Israel. I thought I had outgrown it. I thought I understood the boundary between faith and superstition, and I was fairly certain my mother was on the wrong side of that line. I was wrong, and it took a passage from Numbers, a behavioral economist from Harvard, and a cold morning in a monastery in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia to understand exactly how wrong I was. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what happened in that desert, because the story in Numbers 14 is not the story you were told in Sunday school. Or if it was, you weren't told the part that matters. The Israelites had been brought out of Egypt, 40 years. We throw that number around as a kind of biblical metaphor for a long time, but I want you to feel it. 40 years is not a metaphor. 40 years is the length of a career. It is longer than many marriages. It is the entirety of a child's life from birth to the edge of middle age. An entire generation died in that wilderness without ever arriving, not because of Pharaoh, not because of enemies, because of something they did with their mouths and their minds. The text in Numbers is remarkably specific. It isn't vague spiritual language. Moses sends 12 spies into Canaan, the land they've been promised, the land that represents abundance and arrival and everything they've been working toward. 10 of the 12 come back and say something devastating. They say, yes, the land is good. Yes, it flows with milk and honey. We saw it. But there are giants there, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight. In our own sight, not in the sight of the giants, in their own sight. That distinction almost passed me by the first dozen times I read it. The text is recording an internal state, not an external reality. These men had just returned from a land flowing with abundance, and the conclusion they reached was, we are too small to receive it. And then the murmuring began. And once it began, it spread. The entire community raised their voices and cried. They wept that night, the text says, and then they said something that, when I first fully parsed it, made me sit down. They said, it would have been better to have died in Egypt. Think about that. Think about what it means to have your freedom in your hands, to be dazed from everything you were promised, and to choose, in your mind, to go back to captivity. Not because anyone forced you, because the gap between where you are and where you want to be felt unbridgeable. Because you looked at the obstacle and decided, before trying, that you were a grasshopper. God's response in the text is not primarily about punishment. I know that's how it's usually framed. But when I read it carefully, and I have read it many, many times now, what I see is a description of a consequence. The people have sealed their own fate through what they declared about themselves. They said they would not arrive, and they would not arrive. The mechanism was already in motion. And then I hit the sentence that started all of this. Numbers 14, verse 28. God says, as you have spoken in my ears, so I will do to you. As you have spoken, not as you have sinned, not as you have disobeyed, as you have spoken. The words, the declarations, the habitual murmuring, the constant articulation of smallness and scarcity and impossibility. That is what closed the door. I nearly put the book down here, not because I didn't believe it, but because I suddenly believed it too much, and I wasn't ready for what that meant. Because if that sentence is true, if it operates the way I was beginning to think it operated, then the question I had to face was uncomfortable. I had spent years cataloging manuscripts. I had read the texts with the discipline of a scholar, and I had, at various points in my own life, done exactly what the Israelites did. I had looked at the obstacle, looked at myself, and whispered to no one in particular, I don't think I can. Not quite out loud, not in a way I would have admitted. But the declaration was there, repeated, embedded, quietly shaping what I could and could not perceive as possible. This is the part of the research I almost didn't tell you about, because it's uncomfortable territory, and I don't like being uncomfortable in public. But the sentence deserves honesty. I want to be honest with you about something. This is the moment in my research where I almost walked away. I had been treating this as an intellectual exercise. A scholar looking at ancient patterns, making connections between texts. But when I sat with Numbers 14:28, I realized I wasn't studying a story about ancient Israelites. I was reading a description of something I had seen in living people, in myself, in people I loved. I called my sister that night. She's still in Nigeria. And we talked for 2 hours about our mother, about the rule against complaining in the house, about things we had dismissed as superstition when we were young and ambitious, and certain we understood the world better than she did. My sister said something I keep coming back to. She said, Emeka, Mama wasn't afraid of bad luck. She was afraid of what complaining did to the person doing the complaining. That was a different idea entirely, and it sent me in a direction I hadn't planned. I went looking for the mechanism, the actual biological cognitive mechanism that might explain what the Torah was describing. Not because I thought the Torah needed scientific validation. It doesn't. But because I had spent enough time between two worlds, my mother's in Sukkah and my father's Oxford, to know that when both of them are pointing at the same thing, it's worth paying very close attention. I spent about 6 weeks reading research I had no business reading. Economics papers, neuroscience journals, cognitive psychology literature, that I had to read twice, sometimes 3 times, because it was far outside my usual territory. I was looking for something specific. I wanted to know, is there a measurable effect of habitual negativity on a person's ability to perceive and act on opportunity? Because that is what the Torah text implies, that the murmuring doesn't just express failure, it produces it. And I found it. Not where I expected. A few months before this, I'd been reading a book that had nothing to do with Torah. A Harvard economist named Sendhil Mullainathan and a Princeton psychologist named Eldar Shafir published research on what they called the cognitive bandwidth tax of scarcity. Their central finding, documented through rigorous experimental study, was this. When a person is focused on scarcity, on not having enough money, not having enough time, not having enough resources, their cognitive bandwidth is reduced in a way that is functionally equivalent to losing an entire night's sleep or to a significant drop in measured IQ points. Not metaphorically equivalent, equivalently equivalent. They measured it. They put poor farmers in India through cognitive tests before harvest season when money was extremely tight, and again after harvest when it wasn't. The same farmers, the same intelligence, dramatically different cognitive performance depending on whether their mind was currently under the bandwidth tax of scarcity. They called it tunneling. The mind, overwhelmed by the immediate pressure of lack, loses its ability to see peripheral opportunity. The person trapped in a scarcity mindset literally cannot perceive exits that exist. Not because they're stupid, not because they're unlucky, because the architecture of their attention has been hijacked by the constant awareness of what they don't have. And then Mullainathan and Shafir documented something that made me put the book down in the middle of a cafe in Oxford. They found that the scarcity mindset is self-reinforcing. The bandwidth tax reduces the quality of decisions. The reduced quality of decisions deepens the scarcity. The deepened scarcity intensifies the tunneling. And on it goes. The poor get poorer not only because of systemic injustice, though that is real, and the Torah's legal codes on caring for the poor are among the most rigorous protections ever written. They get poorer also because poverty imposes a cognitive trap that makes escape incrementally harder each year. And here is the part that stopped me. The research suggested that the bandwidth tax could be triggered not just by actual material scarcity, but by the habitual mental attention to scarcity, by what you kept in the foreground of your thinking, by what you rehearsed. Now, I want you to hold Mullainathan and Shafir in one hand, and in the other, I want you to hold Numbers 14:28. As you have spoken in my ears, so I will do to you. The Torah is not describing magic. It is not describing divine punishment in the sense of a father arbitrarily refusing gifts. It is describing the same mechanism that 2 secular researchers at Harvard and Princeton documented 3,000 years later. The habitual declaration of scarcity, the murmuring, the constant articulation of not enoughness, the grasshopper self-image, creates a cognitive and spiritual architecture that closes the very doors you need open. And this is where Solomon comes in. Because Solomon, who saw this same pattern across generations, encoded it in Proverbs with the kind of compressed precision that only makes sense when you understand the Torah background behind it. Proverbs 28, verse 22. A stingy man hastens after wealth and does not know that poverty will come upon him. I used to read this as a moral warning about greed. Don't be greedy, or you'll end up poor. Simple enough. But that reading never fully satisfied me. Because the Hebrew word here, translated variously as stingy, as avaricious, as one with an evil eye, is describing something more specific than greed. It is describing a person whose relationship with resources is fundamentally contractionary, a person who hoards because they are convinced there is not enough, a person who chases wealth in a panicked, grasping way because they cannot imagine a world in which they will ever have enough. Solomon is describing the scarcity mindset. Precisely, clinically, 3,000 years before the behavioral economists. And he says, this person, specifically, will end up poor, not as divine punishment. As a consequence of the architecture they've constructed inside themselves. The poverty that comes upon the stingy man in Proverbs is the poverty that comes from tunneling, from hoarding, from seeing every transaction as a loss rather than an exchange, from the grasshopper self-image that makes them move through a world full of abundance as though they are too small to touch any of it. I sat with this for a long time because there is a version of this argument that collapses into victim blaming, into a kind of prosperity gospel logic that says, you are poor because you think like a poor person, and that is not what Solomon is saying. That is not what the Torah is saying, and it is absolutely not what I am saying. The Torah that contains Numbers 14 also contains some of the most rigorous laws of social protection ever codified, the laws of gleaning, leaving the edges of the field for the poor to harvest, the laws of debt cancellation, the laws of the Jubilee. The entire legal infrastructure of Leviticus and Deuteronomy is built on the premise that systemic poverty is a communal responsibility and a communal failure. The Torah does not say, the poor are poor because they murmured. The Torah says, the people who stood at the border of their promised inheritance, who had already been freed from slavery, who had already seen miracle after miracle. Those people, specifically, chose to rehearse impossibility until it became their declared reality, and the declaration became the trajectory. This is a specific diagnosis for a specific condition, not a universal accusation. Now I need to take you somewhere specific. I told you about the monastery in Tigray. Let me finish that story. It was my second year of field research in Ethiopia. I was cataloging liturgical texts in the Ge'ez language, the ancient Semitic tongue of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and I found preserved in a homily that was still being recited in the daily liturgy, a meditation on Numbers 14, on the sin of the murmurers, on what it means to speak scarcity into existence. The homily was extraordinary. It wasn't a scholarly analysis. It was pastoral instruction, a priest speaking to his congregation, week after week, century after century, warning them about the specific spiritual danger of letting complaint become the dominant voice of the household. The language was different from the Torah. The cultural context was different, but the observation was identical. What you rehearse in your speech, you rehearse in your soul. What you rehearse in your soul becomes what you can and cannot see. The monk who showed it to me, an elderly man named Abba Johannes, who had been at that monastery for 41 years, watched me read it and then said something I wrote down verbatim that evening. He said, "We still pray this every week because we believe the people in the desert are still among us. We are always leaving Egypt. We are always standing at the border of what has been promised, and we're always choosing whether to speak life or death over the journey." He said it quietly, without drama, like a man stating a fact about the weather. And sitting in that cold stone room with the Ge'ez text in front of me, I felt something shift that I hadn't expected. I had spent years trying to determine the point where faith and evidence converged. I thought of it as a line. On one side, the manuscripts. On the other side, the lived experience. What I understood in that room was that I had been drawing the line in the wrong place. The convergence was not between belief and skepticism. It was between ancient observation and modern measurement. The monks in Tigray and Mullainathan at Harvard were describing the same territory. The Torah had simply mapped it first. And here is where the cost of knowing arrives. Because this is something I genuinely wish I could unknow, but I can't. It is not comfortable knowledge. Knowing the mechanism doesn't make it easy to watch. And since that day in Tigray, I can't sit in a conversation with someone who is murmuring, in the biblical sense, in the Numbers 14 sense, without seeing what is happening in real time, not judgment, something closer to grief. After that, every time I heard someone speak the way the Israelites spoke, every time I was in a conversation with someone who couldn't stop articulating all the reasons they would fail, all the ways it was impossible, all the evidence that the heavens were closed, I could see it. I could see the tunneling happening in real time. I could see the bandwidth tax being paid. I could see someone choosing, with every repeated declaration, to stay at the border of what was promised to them and turn back. Worse, I started hearing it in myself, in the half-formed thoughts that run just below speech, the internal murmuring that never becomes a fully articulated complaint, but shapes what you notice, what you reach for, what you decide is worth trying. I had been scholarly about other people's patterns for years. I was considerably less scholarly about my own. This is the price of understanding Numbers 14:28. You don't get to remain a neutral observer. The text becomes a mirror, and you see things in it you were not looking for. I want to be very clear about what this is not saying, because this is a place where the argument can collapse into cruelty if you're not careful, and I have no interest in cruelty. The Torah is not saying that poor people are poor because they complain. That would be obscene. Maimonides, who codified Jewish law in the 12th century in his Mishneh Torah, spent an entire section on the obligation, the rigorous, structural, non-optional obligation, of caring for people in poverty. He ranked charity on 8 levels, and the highest level was not giving money. It was creating conditions for someone to become self-sufficient. The second highest was giving anonymously so that the recipient felt no shame. Maimonides understood that poverty is a systemic reality with external causes, and he encoded the community's structural responsibility into law with a precision that many modern welfare systems have still not matched. The point in the Mishneh Torah that I keep returning to is this. Maimonides writes that the well-being of the soul cannot be assured until the body is secure. He is saying that spiritual flourishing requires material conditions. He is explicitly rejecting the idea that poverty is a virtuous spiritual state. The Torah's vision of the Promised Land, milk and honey, abundance, security, is not metaphorical. It is describing a real material condition that God wants for human beings, and the entire legal infrastructure of the Torah is designed to create and protect it. What the Torah is doing in Numbers 14 is something more specific. It is not blaming poverty on the poor. It is identifying one particular cognitive and spiritual habit, the habitual murmuring, the grasshopper self-image, the constant declaration of scarcity, as a compounding mechanism that makes every external difficulty harder to escape. You can be poor because of injustice. That is real. You can also simultaneously be building, with your own mouth and your own habitual thought patterns, a structure inside yourself that makes it harder for you to see and act on whatever narrow exits do exist. Both can be true at the same time, and only one of them is in your control right now, today. There is also the neuroscience, the same neuroscience that sometimes gets misattributed to Stanford in the way urban legends do. The real research is solid, even when the popular version overstates it. Chronic negativity and habitual complaint literally rewire neural pathways according to what neuroscientists call Hebbian theory. Neurons that fire together wire together. The brain that rehearses scarcity becomes better at perceiving scarcity. It becomes faster at finding evidence of impossibility. It becomes more efficient at the specific task of identifying why things won't work. The cognitive neuroscience of stress adds another layer. Cortisol, the stress hormone that floods your system during chronic anxiety and negative rumination, impairs the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for executive function, planning, problem solving, the ability to imagine futures different from your present. It is, in neurological terms, the organ of hope. Chronic cortisol exposure, produced by ongoing stress and habitual negativity, literally shrinks the cognitive capacity to perceive and pursue possibility. The closed heaven is, at least in part, a closed prefrontal cortex. The biology maps almost perfectly onto the spiritual principle. The murmuring in the desert was not just morally disobedient, it was neurologically self-destructive. The people who complained until they believed they were grasshoppers were, in the language of modern cognitive science, performing a chronic stress response that would have physiologically impaired their ability to function as explorers, settlers, builders, everything they needed to enter and inhabit Canaan. I find that remarkable every time I sit with it. So, what is the one sin that blocks all your money? Not adultery, not dishonesty, though those have their own consequences. Not some hidden transgression you committed years ago that God is now holding against you in the dark. It is this, the habitual declaration of your own smallness, the constant murmuring that there is not enough, that the task is impossible, that the giants are too large, that you are too small to receive what has been promised. The stingy eye turned toward every potential blessing as though receiving it will somehow leave you more exposed. The scarcity mind that tunnels so deeply into what is missing that it loses the capacity to perceive what is present. Solomon saw it. Moses documented its consequences across 40 years of wandering. Maimonides built an entire legal framework to prevent it from becoming a permanent condition. And Mullainathan and Shafir measured it in laboratories, in units of cognitive bandwidth, in IQ point equivalents, and decision quality scores. It is the same thing, one principle, documented across 3,000 years of human observation. And it lives, if it lives anywhere, in the space between your first thought in the morning and your first spoken word. Now let me close a loop I opened at the beginning. I told you I dismissed my mother. I told you I carried her words. Do not call the darkness into this house with your mouth. As a child carries something they're not ready to use yet, I held them in my pocket for 30 years without understanding their weight. My mother wasn't afraid of bad luck in the superstitious sense. She had studied it, not in a university, in the way Egbo women of her generation had studied everything that mattered, in the lived consequences, in watching who in the community stayed perpetually small, not because of what God withheld from them, but because of what they declared about themselves every morning in their kitchens and in their conversations and in the stories they repeated about who they were and what they deserved. She was protecting the neural architecture of her children. She was protecting the spiritual architecture of her household. She understood, from a tradition that is itself thousands of years old, that what you rehearse in your mouth becomes what you perceive with your eyes, and what you cease to perceive, you cease to receive. When I finally understood this, I didn't feel educated. I felt like a man who had driven 2 hours around a mountain to arrive at the spot where, if I had listened at the beginning, I would have been standing all along. Remember what I said at the start? That I was sitting with one sentence? That I couldn't sleep because of what it implied? I started this wanting to understand why some heavens feel closed. I thought the answer would be about a specific sin, a moral transgression, something you did that could be named, confessed, and resolved. What I found was simpler and harder than that. It is not about what you did. It is about what you are doing. Right now, with your breath and your words and the habitual architecture of your attention. The Israelites were not condemned for a single act. They were not punished for one mistake in a weak moment. They were given the harvest of a habitual declaration. We cannot. We are too small. It would have been better to stay enslaved. And the text records with extraordinary precision that they received exactly what they declared. As you have spoken in my ears, so I will do to you. That sentence is either the most terrifying verse in the Torah or the most liberating. I've decided it is both, and that the liberation requires you to sit with the terror first. You asked why your heavens are closed. You asked if you're being punished. You asked why the blessing seems to stop just before it reaches you. I can't give you the full answer, but I can give you what Solomon gave, and what Moses documented, and what Abba Yohannes has been praying over for 41 years in a cold stone monastery in Tigray. The door is not locked from the outside. It is latched from the inside. And the latch is the same sentence you've been repeating in one form or another, possibly for years. The people in the desert had the proof of Egypt behind them. God had moved mountains for them, literally, and they had watched it happen. And they still looked at Canaan and said, "Too big, too hard. We are grasshoppers." The sin that blocked their blessing was not moral failure. It was a failure of imagination, a failure to hold what they already knew against what they feared. And the cost was 40 years? I don't think your cost needs to be 40 years, but I also don't think this is as simple as think positive. That's not what Solomon said. That's not what the Torah documented. The people who entered Canaan were not the ones who felt no fear. They were the ones, and this is crucial, who refused to rehearse the fear until it became their declared reality. Joshua and Caleb were in that same scouting party. They saw the same giants. They returned with the same report of the same land. But they said something different. They said, "We can do this. We have what we need. Let us go up at once." They were not naive. They were not ignoring the difficulty. They were refusing to let the declaration of impossibility become the dominant frequency of their speech and their soul. That distinction is everything. You can acknowledge difficulty without rehearsing failure. You can be honest about obstacles without declaring yourself a grasshopper. You can look at the giants in your life and say, "I see you. You are real, and I'm going anyway." The difference between murmuring and honest acknowledgement of difficulty is not the difficulty. It is what you do with the acknowledgement. You can say, "This is hard, and I don't know how yet." Or you can say, "This is impossible, and I am too small." Both sentences might feel equally honest at 3 a.m. Only one of them begins to close the door. If you've been carrying this, the sense that something is blocking you, that the heavens feel sealed, that you're working and the money doesn't arrive, I want you to sit with one question tonight. Not a question I invented. A question embedded in Numbers 14, in Proverbs 28, in everything my mother knew in the Sukkah, and everything the scientists measured in their laboratories. What have you been speaking into your ears? Because as you have spoken in God's ears, so it will be done to you. That is either a threat or an invitation. I think Solomon meant it as an invitation. This channel exists for exactly these moments, the places where the ancient texts and the hard evidence meet in a way that neither discipline alone could produce. If this conversation has opened something for you, Super Thanks is one way to keep it going. To make sure I can keep reading the manuscripts, keep chasing the connections, keep bringing you the things that won't let me sleep. I read the Gaz texts and the behavioral economics papers and the Talmudic codes so that you don't have to, and so that I can bring you the part that matters. It's never about the transaction. It's about whether this work matters enough to continue. I want to end with a question for you, not rhetorical. I genuinely want to know, because this audience understands these things at a level that still surprises me. Where do you hear the murmuring in your own life? The place where you've been rehearsing the grasshopper story without realizing it was a story you were choosing? Leave it in the comments. Write the word Canaan if this landed somewhere real. I read every one. What you do with this is up to you. But I think you already know what you're going to do. Otherwise, you wouldn't still be here. We'll go deeper next time.